We've looked a little bit tonight at Galatians 2:15 and 16. And this is just another way that Paul, in his Galatian letter, is paralleling things that he's been nailing in the Roman letter that we've been speaking of for the last number of weeks. Well, Paul's giving his own take on grace in his Galatian letter, talking about the faithfulness of Jesus Christ being the methodology whereby God has, in grace, given this gift of the righteousness to humanity through Jesus Christ in such a way that Paul predicts that someone in his audience is going to have the thought, is this grace a license to sin? The same way that Romans 6 opens up the chapter with, should we just go on sinning because we have this absolute irreversible grace that's not dependent on anything that we have done or will ever do, but on Jesus Christ alone? Should we just go on sinning because we can get away with it? Well, Paul says, heck no, in Romans 6, and continues to emphasize that thought as to why in Romans 6, verses 2 to 11. We've been talking about that in some past weeks. But in his Galatians chapter 2, verse 17, listen to how Paul is anticipating that someone in his audience is going to come off with the thought, well then, are we just going to just go on sinning because of this right standing with God that is completely according to the principle of grace, unmerited favor, unworked for kindness, that we don't have to do anything but just be a human being and automatically Jesus Christ is our right standing with God? Well, Paul's expressing Galatians 2:17 in the following way. If, while seeking to be righteous, there's the justified word again, being declared righteous in the eyes of the law by complete obedience, not neglecting one point of the law, because in James 2:10, if you neglect a point of the law in terms of obedience, you're not given credit for being justified or right with God as far as the law standards are concerned, right? So in Galatians 2:17 he says, if while seeking to be declared upright in Christ, notice in verse 17 the phrase, in Christ. I suggest that the phrase, in Christ, of verse 17 is parallel to the phrase, faithfulness of Jesus Christ in verse 16. I just believe that when Paul says in Galatians 2:17 that we're seeking to be right with God on the basis that Jesus represents us before God, therefore we come to God in Christ, not in our own performance, if you will, because we're seeking to be right with God in Christ and not seeking to be right with God by something that we can say, well, I can distinguish myself from my neighbor because I've done a verb, I've done some action, whether that's belief or anything else that you can imagine what we might think would be our part in being right with God, which, by the way, would make it a principle, the opposite of grace, if we could say that we had a part in it. But the human nature so often wants to determine that I've done something for which I would be rewarded in my own sense of justice. My neighbor didn't do that verb, didn't do that action, so they need to be punished, but justify, vindicate me because I've done my righteous thing. And God says by the standards of the law, you got to do the whole law, you can't just do part of it. You got to have the faith that leads to the faithfulness to get the right standing with God as far as the law is concerned. And Jesus Christ is the only one that's got it. Okay, so Galatians 2:17. If while seeking to be declared upright in Christ, and I'm saying that there's a parallel between Paul's phrase in Christ, verse 17, and his phrase faithfulness of Jesus Christ back in verse 16. I'm saying that what is in Christ is something that is determined by his faithfulness, not something that would be in me, the old Adam, the old man, that's thinking, well, I've done this, so count me righteous. No, that'd be in the realm of myself, not in the realm of Christ. That'd be my attempt at faithfulness, not Jesus Christ's faithfulness on my behalf and your behalf, whoever you are, because of the good news of who Jesus is in relationship to you and to me. But nonetheless, if I can just get a sense of what Paul's doing in Galatians chapter 2. Verse 17, if while seeking to be declared upright in Christ, it becomes evident that we ourselves are sinners. Remember, Paul had been talking about, well, we're Jews by birth, and we're not sinners of the other nations, but we find ourselves to be sinners. Well, he's basically saying, we're finding that, just because we have Jesus as our righteous representative, it doesn't mean that in our own day-to-day experience, we have anything that we can call righteous to describe our performance of trying to live for God. Because in verse 17, Galatians 2:17, it becomes evident that we ourselves, who we are, based on ourselves, are sinners, just like the other nations. We Jews by birth, we don't have any better success pleasing God than the nations that we say as Jews don't know God. But we know God, Romans 2:17. You think that you know God, you think you know His will, you think that you approve of what is superior, because you have the revelation, the law of what's right. But do you not teach yourself when you tell other people they shouldn't do things? Do you not preach to yourself when you're preaching against certain things? Don't you learn from your own law that you can't do it? Basically, the idea comes across that way to me in Romans 2:17 and following. It's just that in the question that's being raised in Galatians 2:17, if it becomes evident that we ourselves are sinners, yet we're saying that Jesus is our righteousness, and we have right standing with God because of His faithfulness, even though we ourselves are sinners, then Paul is thinking that somebody in the Galatian congregation is going through the process of thinking, well, does this mean that grace is a license to sin? Does this mean that we should just go on sinning? Well, listen to how Paul addresses this in Galatians 2:17. And I'll start again in Galatians 2:17. If while seeking to be right with God in Christ, it becomes evident that we ourselves are sinners, does this mean that Christ is a minister of sin? The NIV idiomatically translates this, does this mean that Christ promotes sin? In other words, the old age thinking in the flesh of, well, does this mean it's a license to sin? Does this mean that Christ promotes sin? Paul, are you preaching this gospel of grace so we can just go and sin and see how much forgiveness that we're going to have? Well, yeah, there's going to be unlimited forgiveness for the unlimited amount of sin. Romans 5:20, the law was added so that the trespass would increase, and where the trespass increased, the sin increased all the more. And then there's forgiveness all the more. But is that the attitude that Paul wants us to have in terms of the way that we should live the Christian life, that we should just sin because we can be forgiven? In fact, we're already forgiven. All the way to the end of time, we're forgiven, right? But Paul's statement in Galatians 2:17, because it's right with God in Christ and not because we are righteous, we're just total sinners, but yet the standing is still right with God because of being in Christ, then does this mean that we should just consider Christ to be a minister of sin, or NIV, that Christ promotes sin? I mean, are we to have this attitude toward grace that it's just licensed sin? That, to me, is the way that Galatians 2:17 comes across to me. Like Paul's just thinking, somebody in the Galatian audience is hearing this message of grace and is just thinking, oh, maybe Christ just promotes sin, or maybe, he's just a minister of sin. Well, Paul says at the end of verse 17, absolutely not. The same meganoito, the Greek phrase meganoito, that he used back in Romans 6, where he introduced the same thought. Shall we just go on sinning so that grace may increase? And then the Greek meganoito is used. Heck no. It's a very strong expression in Greek. Absolutely not. Well, it's the same meganoito in Galatians 2:17, where I think the NIV translates it as absolutely not. In other words, he's just saying in Galatians 2:17, yes, we're seeking to be that Jesus is our righteousness as prophesied by Jeremiah. He's the Lord our righteousness. Yeah, we're seeking that He is the one that represents us righteously before God. And we're saying that it doesn't matter what we do, righteously or unrighteously, in contributing to the matter. As far as that contribution, it's negated by the fact that we didn't obey the whole law, so we didn't get credit for righteousness. Therefore, we deserve to die. And that's exactly what Paul's going to say shortly, that we did get, in fact, on the cross was death as required by the law. The old man was crucified. Why? Because the law demanded a sinner must die. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay? For right now, Galatians 2:17, he's saying, is Christ this minister of sin? Is Christ the one that promotes sin? Meganoito, absolutely not. In other words, Paul is just saying the answer to your question is a simple big no. It's not a license to sin. Heck no. But then what happens is he gets into Galatians 2:18, and he's now beginning to talk about the reason why the person motivated in such a way as to want to reject grace and go back to the law as something that makes sense to the religious flesh. Let's just reject grace and let's just go back to the law. Well, in Galatians 2:18 now, he's going to go ahead and say, okay, what if we do just go back to the law? What if we just reject grace? What if we just say, yeah,